Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Katy Didden. Katy is visiting assistant professor in the creative writing program at the University of Oregon and a poet. Her first book, The Glacier's Wake, won the Lena Miles Weaver Todd Prize from Pleiades Press and was published in 2013. Her poems and reviews appear in journals such as the Kenyon Review, Missouri Review, Poetry, and the Best New Poets Anthology of 2009. Thank you, Katy, for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Would you mind reading one or two poems to start from The Glacier's Wake?
I would love to. So the first one I will read is actually set in the Pacific Northwest somewhat. So the title of the poem is Before Edison Invented Lights, and the white volcano that I mention is Mount Baker. Before Edison invented lights, if you stood outside at night at a moonless hour, you could mark your place in the universe by how you fit among the field of stars. The world was colder then, and the distances between one family and another were bigger by an exponent, which meant people traveled more if they didn't go as far. Anyone who watches a bird flying, a small bird especially, and sees it rise in full flight like a voice shifting octaves knows that you can get anywhere if you only imagine the connecting line between where you are and where you'd like to go. A stone on a stone makes a wall, an arch in a tower holds a bell. The air in the bell catches sound, and the wind carries it over the lake where it fills the white sail. You navigate by stars. Between the stars are more stars you can't see, and between all stars is a dark silence and the great pull we only understand as longing, to which we're tuned like bells, over which our eyes draw lines between the bright places. We give the blackness shapes with names of gods. In a fist-sized glass dome, in a vacuum atmosphere not unlike the universe, Edison, after many trials, suspended a filament of straight bamboo, whittled down to its threads, then charred by heat until it resembled the stuff of stars. It burned for 600 hours, and the ceilings of our dreams lost their dim flickerings to the steady glow of incandescence. And now, whole cities shine up like planets, and most stars, to our eyes, have gone out. Unless you travel. In the North Cascades, on a ridge overlooking a white volcano, the only thing darker than the night is the gliding shadow of a great owl. When you sleep with your face to the sky, the stars are not so much above as around you. Stare long enough and you begin to feel you could lift your body off the earth and hover in the black night on the web of your awe at a billion suns, towards which everything you are made of yearns.
Would you read another?
Sure. I was just thinking maybe I would read, let's see, another Pacific Northwest poem that I don't often read. This one is set in the San Juan Islands, called Lopez Island. And this one could also introduce one of the other themes in the book, which is elegy. Lopez Island. When I should have left off grieving, I carried you with me across the water. I listened to the rock crabs burrow in the sand. They scritched their claws along the underbellies of rocks, the sound of lines. The tide sound rolled, was round, refrained. The crabs were green, like the sea, with oily shadows at the joints like the backs of waves. I'd lift the rocks and watch them flee the sun.
So those two poems are wonderful for my question. Like those poems, the volume is filled with verse about nature, geology, travel, wilderness, and landscape. You managed to connect very precise descriptions of the natural world, of glaciers, of sycamore trees, of mountains, waterfalls, with profound human emotions like love and grief. How do you understand the relationships between nature and the human? Why is that the way you think you express these?
I guess I have a few answers. The first is the relationship between nature and poetry for me. I think it dates back to my time as an undergrad, because I had core requirements and I had to take science classes. And I took courses in geology, and they really lit my imagination. I took a class called Ring of Fire, and it was all about plate tectonics and volcanoes. And the professor, Mike Weissession, used all kinds of metaphors to describe the inner workings of the earth. And that was the same time I was taking my first poetry workshop. And so somehow in my mind, those got fused, the rhythms of the earth and the rhythms of poetry. So that is, I think, partly why geology is the go-to image realm for me. But I also do think, just personally, that when I go into the wilderness is often the time when everything else falls away, and I'm much more alert to the strangeness of the world and also to geologic time. So, you know, I mentioned that the book is elegiac. So the nature is in kind of the romantic sense of self-elegy. So the speaker confronts these dramatic landscapes and realizes how the smallness of her own life and the briefness of the human lifespan. I guess those are two answers. There's something about being in nature that makes me more receptive to the human place in the world.
Any reader of your work is immediately struck by your precision, your attention to and mastery of poetic craft. So you're not a poet who just goes out in nature and sort of transcribes the flow. I mean, these are, this is not just the spontaneous overflow of emotions, right? You're not, you don't write entirely in free verse. Your poems are highly crafted. Why is that kind of technical precision important for you?
Well, you know, this book was I think I was working on poems for 15 years by the time I have this book come out. So I'm glad you see that there's some craft going on here, because I worked hard for that. I think for me, when I'm writing in free verse, I tend to be more prose-like, or that it doesn't appeal to me so much to have a looseness in phrase. I like to have constraints to work against. I like that pressure on language. And so I really get into poems in three different ways. The first is narrative, if I have a story. But if I'm going to tell a story, I like to have something to put pressure on language. I also might go with form. I use a lot of Welsh syllabic forms in this book, for example. I love working in syllabics.
Can you just tell our viewers what that is, briefly?
Well, so the easiest example is the haiku. Everyone's learned 575. It's when you're counting the number of syllables in a word. And so a haiku has 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, and you can have any different combination of words to make up that pattern. And my biggest influence in my poetry has been Marianne Moore. I did my undergraduate thesis on her. And she uses a very elaborate syllabic pattern, you know, from 9 to 13 syllable lines to 6 syllable lines. She'll do maybe a 6-line stanza with different numbers for each line, and then she'll repeat it in the second stanza. And she also uses rhyme, which I think is really significant. So I like using syllabics because it's a way to resist the iamb, and I love writing in iambs also, but to add another texture of sound in the book.
Sorry, I interrupted you in your answer to my question. Maybe it's lost now.
No, so one way I get into poems is by narrative, and if I write in a story, I'd like to have some pressure on the language that helps to, you know, usually when I'm writing about a story, I don't know why I'm writing about it, and the form is what teaches me, or the sound pattern is what teaches me what the emotion is behind the story. Or I'll write in form. I'll have an idea of a form, like the Sycamore Poems in here, using Welsh syllabic forms. or I'll get in by sound. So there's a few poems in here where I'm hearing a sound pattern and I'm just writing into that. And so those are less narrative and more exploratory.
You just alluded to the Sycamore Poems. There's a number of striking persona poems in the volume which give voice to non-humans, in particular a glacier, a sycamore, and a wasp. And these poems, in these poems, these voices comment on very human concerns, so on middle age, on weddings, on lack of sleep. Tell us about those poems. Where do they come from, and how do you understand them?
They come from a very specific place. The wasp was first, and I was at the Vermont Studio Center, and my friend Maria Hummel was in the studio next to mine. And there was a wasp that would visit us, and it was in its last days of life, and so it could barely fly, and it would hover basically at eye level, and it would just silently come into the studio, and it was very scary, but Maria, compassionate woman that she is, just took a huge affection to this wasp and named it Raphael, the archangel. And then I was in my studio the next day, and I saw under the doorway Maria had slipped an index card, and there was the dead wasp, and it said R.I.P. Raphael. So this became my muse, and I took the wasp and just studied it, and was also thinking about archangels and Renaissance painters, Raphael, and so that's where they came. And I also chose an organic form for that. So the wasp poems, most of them are in cinched tercets, just like a wasp. So something about working in that form helped me to access a voice, and I was really bringing in with the wasp things that were just happening in my own life. So having this other lens on it. I was making my way, I was attending a wedding right after the Vermont Studio Center. And I was also looking at all kinds of different prompts for my work. When I looked back on the wasp poems, the voice seemed very much to me like an academic generalist. And so actually when I generated the Kierkegaard poem, that was well after Vermont, and I had that in mind. So I also just really loved this way of accessing a new perspective on the environment, and also a way of accessing voice. And so I wanted to keep going with that, and I had visited Perito Moreno Glacier in Patagonia, and it had seemed really like a living, breathing creature. And it occurred to me, since everyone was taking flash photos of the glacier, watching it calve, that she was very much like a former Hollywood starlet. And so those themes that you see are really me exploring two different lenses on that kind of experience, this conflation of consumerist culture and also the natural world. And the sycamore is my secret second persona for this. Sycamore is a minister. And it's a very particular sycamore I have in mind in Missouri. And the Welsh forms seemed like a very stately way of accessing that voice. And I was interested in what a minister might be interested in: forgiveness, balance, things like that. Praise.
Read one or two of those?
Yes,
your choice?
I'd be glad to. Let's see. I will read the Sycamore on Balance first. So you'll hear Marianne Moore. This is a syllabic form with rhyme, with very intense rhyme, actually. The Sycamore on Balance. A symmetry of forces, yes, but not of shape. The roots, a mess of curves. Like slow snakes, they incorporate rocks. With full weight pressing down, my trunk arrows skywards. For humans, centering's awkward. You lack longevity, can't fight gravity, grow heavy. What wayward cantilevering keeps you calm? When sorrow settles, blights your limbs, what dark contortions fix you to the source? Contrition, the light-aimed psalm. And then I'll read a Glacier I'll read one of each maybe.
Sure.
Okay. So I will read The Glacier on Lack of Sleep. The Glacier on Lack of Sleep. When day comes, the light's too bright. A yawn forms behind the spires of your eyes. Your jaw cracks, splits a crevasse. Little parts of you collapse. If you were older or cared less about being seen, you would lie down in public. And then let's see if I can do this one, The Wasp on Weddings. It has a little unusual voicing in it. Let me find it. The Wasp on Weddings. This is also because the god of weddings is Hymenaeus, and the wasp is in the genus Hymenopterae. So that's the link between these. The Wasp on Weddings. These days we gods are diminished things, black-winged. I float like the infinitesimal hesitation, the unheard breath after I. I wasp will, I wasp do. I hover over the first course of figs. In the old days, the homage of corsets, now the calla's attenuating stems, the bridesmaids in blue with white sashes, the bride divided by the arm of the groom, at her waist, as if she would break in two.
You have spoken about the importance in those poems of voice, and you've also spoken about sound and rhythm. Why is reading poetry, both for poets and for readers of poetry, important? Aloud, reading poetry aloud. Why is it important to read poetry aloud? What does reading poetry aloud give us, help us to understand?
It helps us to sound out the music of the poem. I think sometimes we might read it too quickly if it's on the page. I mean, I think there are poems that are written for the page, and that's increasingly true. And so the visual aspect of a poem could be very important in the sense of how that works, how someone's navigated the blank page. But I often see poems as a score, a way of sounding out the rhythm and the rhyme. And so when you read it out loud, things that you might not have picked up on off the page will become clearer. So when I'm revising poems especially, I'll read them out loud because I can't hear them in the same way when they're on the page. And then when I'm revising, I'll go over a part. I can tell when the rhythm is stuck or if it's not sounding the right way. So
you said it's like a score, the music, the rhythm. Are you a musician?
No, I'm not. I strum on the guitar, but maybe this is, if I had had a different training, I do think there's a lot of conversation between music and poetry. In fact, when I teach my students prosody, we'll often drum without any words first, just to get them a sense of the rhythms that to listen for under the words. So, or to teach caesura, or to get them to understand how to vary a tempo in a poem.
I've read an essay you wrote where you stated that words change us, and what prompted that was some comments about Martin Luther King's delivery of speeches, and it seemed to me that you weren't merely talking about the content of words, you were talking in these ways about rhythm and sound. Is that right? Is that what you mean when you say words change us?
It is right. It's a little mystical, but it is, yeah, that's what I believe. One of the oldest patterns in poetry is repetition. And what happens when you take the repetition of even a sound pattern and push it forward, there's a real crescendo, just like in a musical piece. And it puts different emphasis on the words in that list, and it builds. So yeah, I do believe it, and I think it has effects on us that we're not really aware of. You know, I think someone's made an argument that many of our most memorable lines from our politicians are iambic, you know, ask not what your country can do for you, 7 years ago. Well, Lincoln was a little more of a virtuoso. He actually had access to a lot of variations, but that iambs, it really moves us to the rhythm of the heartbeat. So there's something about that link that is very emotional.
You've mentioned the influence of Marianne Moore on you as a writer. Many poets have an MFA in creative writing, as you do. It's not as common for a poet to also have a PhD in literary history, which you also have. It's clear, I think, reading your poems, Marianne Moore obviously jumps out immediately, but I thought of Elizabeth Bishop, and there are at times I thought of Mina Loy. There are other poets. Obviously, the history of poetry is important for you. Why is that important? Why is having a consciousness and being educated in the history of poetry important?
After my MFA, I felt as though I wasn't quite finished with that work of studying poetry. It really felt like an apprenticeship to have some accountability for writing about these poets. And Elizabeth Bishop has always been a favorite of mine, and Sylvia Plath. And also, by studying with different professors, I was exposed to artists I wouldn't have read. So George Oppen became a huge figure for me because Elizabeth Arnold was my thesis director in my MFA. So I was teaching after my MFA as an adjunct, and I felt as though there were big gaps in my reading. I wanted to, it was as if I had the MFA had introduced me to all kinds of resources, and I just wanted to spend more time pursuing that line of improving my craft through reading. And I really loved my PhD program. Most of my classmates already had their MFAs, so they were some of the best workshops I've ever been in. And all of them had studied with different mentors across the country, and all of them had also been teaching for years and years. And so this kind of conversation that we had and the poets that they'd been reading and influenced by, it was, I'm really grateful for the chance to do that. And then also working with lit faculty and having, again, this accountability for really studying poets I've always loved and really getting into their work. And it absolutely changed my work for the better. And I think for me, I needed the structure of a PhD. I don't think everyone needs that. But
you've written that writing poetry is not a solitary act, that it's highly communal. You've begun to explain that already, but could you say a little bit more about that?
That's just been my experience. It comes from reading. So when I say sound, it's often by reading other poets that I'll start to hear a new line of rhythms. For example, studying the rhythms of Frank Bedard. Suddenly you see these entirely different possibilities for how to organize a line. So it's communal because of reading, but it also is, to me, my favorite quote from Stanley Kunitz is, poets are solitaries with a heightened sense of community. And this has been very true in my experience, that it's very paradoxical, but we seek each other out, and we have intense bonds. I mean, it's a very, you're not making money from poetry, so people who choose it have this kind of dedication. I think it just seems to be consistent in people's characters. The poets that I meet have real integrity in an approach to their work. So I've just been really grateful that choosing a life of poetry has also led me to these amazing friendships. And so those conversations come into the poems, whether through workshop or just by hearing what other people are trying or are interested in. But it also is just the culture, I think, of poetry in America is very communal. So,
would you read another poem for us?
Sure. Let's see. I will read one of the geology poems. So this is actually a place I've never been, which is another thing I'm interested in exploring. It's called Mind's Eye Island. Earth's newest island is Surtsey. It erupted above sea level in 1963, signaling in smoke, settling over the sea in a slope of scoria. An island, we've decided, where we're not allowed to live, only seals and fulmars, guillemots and whooper swans. In uninhabited ocean, Surtsey's eruption harmed no one, and no one harms islands on purpose. But then, a booted foot, a field of untrod ash. It is hard to leave be what the law ropes off. Before signatures on mainland pages paired the rim of Surtsey with a hefty fee, a rebounding belt of ethics, reporters for Perry Match left southwest Iceland for the newest shore along the mid-Atlantic fissure. They stayed 15 minutes before the roaring, airborne ashen fire scared them back. Then the eruption echoed in ink, a surface to people with willow, rock pillow, algae, sea. They staked claims for the sake of merely having seen. Little Surtsey adds itself to the world, brimming with news from the core. Her name is Fire. She's an ingot. She's a blot. She's the coda of the long song Ice and Fire sing. I watched Surtsey be born again online. The wing of a plane in the frame against Surtsey's plume of steam, its billowing flag of cumulus upping the clear skies, hazing its gray over the sun. All that's taken root arrived in the bellies of birds and seals. This is the 15th anniversary of the discovery of a single earthworm burrowing itself through Surtsey's increasingly nutritious soil. The island erupts in thought. A little boat over the blank reaches its resistance. And I'm glad there's somewhere we can't wreck, where Earth's beginning gets reset. At the place we can never see, where we'll never set our feet, grow ideas. Imagine how we'd hew a place to sleep out of the solid rock that waves won't rock. Moss under the shadow of the albatross and ash-halved boulders of pumice. Oh, how they look like a cluster of huts that would shelter the body from sun and dust.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have about 30 seconds left. My last question to you, which I told you I would ask you, are there any poets or volumes of poetry that you'd recommend to our viewers?
Absolutely. I've been, one of the ones that I've read recently is Patricia Smith's Blood Dazzler. And actually, when we're talking about persona, I read the book after I'd written this one, but I'm fascinated with how she's negotiating persona in that book and how she's speaking to Hurricane Katrina, and I highly recommend that book to readers.
Thank you for that recommendation. Thank you, Katy, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
I've been speaking with poet Katy Didden, a visiting professor in the creative writing program at the University of Oregon. The Glacier's Wake is her first book. Thank you so much for watching.